What would you do if you were disrespected every day, but inside you held a secret that could change everything? What if the bullies thought you were weak, but in reality they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives? This is the story of Jamal Carter, a black boy who transferred to Brookside High and quickly became the target of Blake Harrison, the king of the school. They thought he was an easy target, but they had no idea that Jamal was not someone who could be easily defeated. The cruel jokes turned into violence, but when Jamal fought back, the whole school was shocked. A twist no one expected, a lesson Blake would never forget. Get ready for a story of justice, redemption, and the downfall of a bully. Where are you watching this from? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Brookside is a small town where it feels like nothing ever changes. Quiet streets, small roadside shops, and a community where everyone knows each other. Here, everyone is the same, not just in thought, but also in skin color. So when Jamal Carter, a black boy, showed up at Brookside High, he instantly became the center of attention. In this school, students of color were nearly non-existent, and if they were always on the outskirts. Jamal didn't care. He was used to it. His family had moved to Brookside because of his mother's job, but from the moment he set foot here, he knew he didn't belong. On his first day, when he walked into the classroom, Jamal could feel the stares from everywhere. Some students whispered softly, others sneered. He chose a seat in the corner of the room, far from the gazes, keeping a safe distance. Not because he was shy, but because he knew he didn't need friends here. But it was his silence that attracted the wrong kind of attention, the kind that saw bullying as the school's rule. Brookside High had its unspoken rules, and Jamal would soon learn them the hard way. Brookside High doesn't have an official hierarchy of power, but everyone knows that the real rules of the place aren't set by the teachers or the administration. They are set by Blake Harrison, the unspoken ruler of the school. As the son of the head football coach, Blake not only has the advantage of status but also wields absolute influence over the students. He's the person everyone wants to be on the side of, or at least no one dares to stand against. Blake doesn't operate alone. He's always surrounded by a loyal group of satellites, individuals willing to do whatever it takes to maintain the power they've built. Ryan Carter, Blake's sharp right-hand man, with a smirk that always carries a cruel irony, never directly engages but is always the one to initiate bullying with words as sharp as knives. Matt Douglas, a guy with bulging muscles but a head too dull to do anything other than punch and kick, is always the first to dive in when force is needed. Connor Mitchell, who takes pleasure in psychological manipulation, spreads rumors and stirs up gossip, turning victims into the laughingstock of the entire school. And lastly, Chase Walker, a quiet but the most intimidating of the group, as he never shows any emotion, never needs words to threaten anyone. He simply acts coldly and mercilessly. They are not your typical bullies. They are the ones who set the order of Brookside High, deciding who gets to fit in, who lives on the margins, who can walk with their head held high, and who must walk with their head down, silently, whenever they pass through the halls. People like them don't just use punches or simple insults. They love to watch their victims gradually lose their self-confidence, pushed to the bottom of the food chain, turned into entertainment for the whole school. And when Jamal Carter arrives, he unknowingly signs himself up to be their target. A new student is supposed to flatter, try to fit in, and be careful not to upset the wrong people. But Jamal doesn't do that. He doesn't try to make friends, doesn't show fear or confusion, doesn't try to prove himself, doesn't show even the slightest hesitation under their scrutinizing gazes. He simply doesn't care, and that indifference bothers Blake and his group more than anything else. In their eyes, Jamal isn't someone worthy of respect, nor Is he interesting enough to make friends with? He's the perfect prey. A kid with no one to protect him, a stranger to this town, a black boy in a sea of similar faces. And that means he will pay the price. The lunch that day was nothing special. Just the usual cold trays of food. Groups of friends gathered according to the unspoken rules of the school. The sounds of laughter mingling with the clattering of forks and trays, and somewhere in the background, whispers about the new student. But amidst all the familiar things there was something different. Something that made some people uncomfortable, though they couldn't pinpoint why. Jamal Carter, sitting alone in the corner, quietly eating, completely uninterested in the world around him. No one sat with him. No one spoke to him, but no one saw him as out of place or awkward either. He simply existed there, like an invisible person in a world not meant for him. The way he kept his distance, the way he didn't seem to care about the scrutinizing gazes of others, all of it made him a paradox in the eyes of those who were used to defining the order of Brookside High. At the table across the cafeteria, Blake Harrison had been watching all of it. He wasn't the type to pay attention to people who didn't matter, but today, something felt off. Jamal wasn't like the other new students. Kids who moved to this town typically fell into two categories. Either they tried to fit in, seeking approval from the influential groups, or they were weak, easy prey from the moment they stepped foot in school. But Jamal didn't fit either category. He wasn't trying to make friends, nor did he appear scared or awkward. He simply didn't care. And that bothered Blake in a strange way. No one ignored him. No one could act like he didn't exist. At Brookside High, he was the one who set the rules, the one who decided who could walk with their head held high, and who had to lower their gaze when passing through the hallways. And someone like Jamal, a black kid from out of town, with no one to back him up, someone who dared to ignore his presence, couldn't exist without being punished. Blake pushed his tray away, stood up decisively. Ryan, Matt, Connor, and Chase immediately understood. No need for him to give orders. They stood up with him, forming a slow-moving wall as they made their way to the corner of the room where Jamal still sat, calm as though the whole cafeteria didn't exist except for him. A loud bang echoed as Blake slammed his hand on the table, making Jamal's tray shake slightly, but he didn't flinch. Not a raised eyebrow, no awkwardness, no sign that he was surprised or upset. He simply continued eating, as if he was completely unaware of the 5 figures now standing before him. Blake leaned forward, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, intentionally so. "Don't see you on the football team," he said, pausing, narrowing his eyes at Jamal as if sizing up his prey before making a move. "You know how to play, or are you just good at running?" A few laughs erupted from the nearby tables. Heads started to turn, attention shifting toward Jamal, but he still didn't respond. No forced smile, no embarrassment, no rebuttal. He just continued eating, his eyes remaining unnervingly calm. Ryan, standing next to Blake, smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Or maybe he doesn't speak English? Connor chuckled, nudging Matt as though he'd heard a brilliant joke. Matt, as usual, laughed loudly, excited. Chase said nothing, but his gaze silently observed everything, ready to act if a fight broke out. And then, under the waiting eyes of everyone in the cafeteria, Jamal set down his fork, picked up his tray, stood up, and walked away without saying a word, without a glance, without any sign that he felt offended or intimidated. The atmosphere shifted for a moment. Those who had been waiting for an argument, an angry response, or at least some sign of discomfort from Jamal, were caught off guard and a bit disappointed. The cafeteria fell silent for a brief second, before murmurs began to rise. Blake watched Jamal's retreating figure, his eyes darkening. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He was used to controlling situations, to making people respond to him the way he wanted, through fear, submission, or anger. But Jamal had done none of that. He didn't know how to handle this situation. Ryan crossed his arms and shook his head disdainfully. Who does this guy think he is? Matt raised an eyebrow, half joking, half serious. I think he doesn't know the rules here. Connor smirked, his voice tinged with amusement. He's just trying to act different. But we all know, guys like him are never really strong. They just need to be put in their place. Blake stood there, his eyes fixed on the door Jamal had just walked through. He no longer heard the voices of his friends around him. In his mind, a plan began to form. He wouldn't accept being ignored. He wouldn't allow anyone to walk around as though he didn't exist. And he sure as hell wouldn't let Jamal have peace here. If he wants to be different, Blake said slowly, but with conviction, then I'll help him stand out. Ryan chuckled, tilting his head at Blake. You got a plan. Blake didn't answer immediately. He just smiled slowly, a smile without warmth. And in that moment, Ryan, Matt, Connor, and Chase all knew that the game had officially begun. Blake wasn't the type to let an insult slide, especially when he was ignored in front of the entire cafeteria like he was invisible. Jamal might think he doesn't care about him, might think that staying quiet and avoiding confrontation would let him escape the grasp of Brookside High. But Blake wasn't going to let that happen. He didn't just want to teach Jamal a lesson. He wanted to make him an example, a warning to anyone who dared challenge the order Blake had established. And like a patient predator, he began to tighten the noose, slowly eroding Jamal's self-respect, inch by inch, pushing him to react. It started with what seemed like accidental bumps. Jamal walked down the hall, always alone, with no one beside him, no one to stand up for him. Then one day, a hard shove into his shoulder made him stumble. When he turned around, Ryan merely shrugged, smirking. Oh, sorry, didn't see you there. The next day, as he opened his locker, a cup of water was dumped directly onto his books, soaking the pages, blurring the ink into a mess. Connor stood a few steps away, whistling mockingly, his eyes gleaming with amusement as he watched the scene unfold. Jamal didn't react. He didn't furrow his brow, didn't glare, didn't rush to clean up the soggy mess like a beaten-down weakling. He just quietly took his books, shook the water off the covers, and walked away without a glance back. But that only made Blake's group angrier, because to them, the victim had to show submission. The victim had to be scared, awkward, had to fight back weakly, and eventually accept their place in the food chain. But Jamal didn't. He walked down the hall like no one existed around him, like all the provocations were nothing more than a passing breeze. Blake gritted his teeth. He couldn't let this go on. He decided to take it up a notch. One day, rumors suddenly started spreading through the school. He got expelled for fighting. His parents moved here to escape trouble. I heard he almost killed someone once. Connor took charge of this, whispering the stories to each small group, letting them spread and mutate into even scarier versions with every retelling. Within a week, people began to whisper as Jamal passed by, eyes wary, heads turning, conversations abruptly stopping when he came near. But even surrounded by the storm of rumors, Jamal didn't react. He didn't explain himself, didn't deny anything, didn't try to defend himself. He just kept walking through it all, like a ghost, unbothered by the world. Blake started to feel something wasn't right. Every student who had been bullied had a breaking point. Some broke instantly, some endured longer but eventually cracked. But Jamal was different. Blake could sense it instinctively. There was something about him that wasn't like the others. He needed to test it, and he decided this time Jamal would have no choice but to react. That night, Jamal left the school library later than usual. He enjoyed the quiet of the place at night, where he could read without being disturbed, where he could focus on the pages instead of the gazes around him. But as he stepped outside the building, the atmosphere around him felt different. A heavy silence hung in the air. He felt it immediately. Footsteps. Light, steady, but not of one person. Jamal didn't turn around immediately. He knew that once he turned, it would mean he acknowledged their presence. But when he reached the intersection near the sports field, he stopped. Not because he was scared, but because he knew this was bound to happen sooner or later. "You think you can keep ignoring us?" Blake's voice came from behind, low but mocking. As Jamal slowly turned, he saw Blake, Ryan, Matt, Connor, and Chase blocking his way, their faces clearly showing their intentions. He had been cornered. "Don't worry, no one's here to witness this," Ryan said, his voice almost cheerful, as if this was just a game everyone had to play. Matt cracked his knuckles and stepped forward. "Just a little chat. No one wants things to get tense, right?" Jamal didn't answer. He just looked at Blake, calm, neither surprised nor scared. That only made Blake more frustrated. "You're going to learn to respect us." Blake stepped closer, leaning down to look Jamal in the eye. But just as he took a step forward, Jamal gently tilted his head. A small but purposeful movement, as if he were assessing the situation, as if he were weighing his options. Blake suddenly realized this was the first time Jamal had really looked him in the eye, and in that moment he felt something wasn't right. Jamal's eyes held no fear, no sign of weakness, nothing but a dangerous calm. And then, before anyone could react, everything changed in an instant. Jamal moved, faster than anyone in Blake's group could imagine. Before Matt could even throw a punch, Jamal spun around and twisted his wrist in a precise lock. Matt screamed, crumpling to the ground in pain, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Blake's eyes widened in shock. What the hell just happened? Jamal stood there, still holding his calm demeanor, as if what had just happened was nothing out of the ordinary. He exhaled softly, then said, for the first time ever, "I've been trying to avoid this, but you're not worth me being afraid of." The atmosphere in the alley became thick, as if something invisible was pressing down on the air. There were no more laughs, no more loud taunts like usual, only 5 figures surrounding Jamal, their eyes gleaming with a mix of aggression and anticipation. Blake stood at the center, his face calm, but there was a cold hint of amusement in his gaze. "Listen, kid, no one's gonna help you here." Blake took a step forward, his voice not loud, but enough to make one thing clear. This was not a chance encounter, but a warning, a carefully staged event, not to tease like in the cafeteria, not to play around like in the hallways, but to settle an unresolved issue. Jamal sighed lightly, not out of fear, but because he knew this moment would come sooner or later. He had tried to take the path of silence, tried not to pay attention to the provocations, tried to walk as if they didn't exist. But the problem with people like Blake was that they didn't want to be ignored. He didn't just want to teach Jamal a lesson. He wanted to see him afraid, to see him submit, to see him look at him as if he controlled everything. But Jamal would never do that. He looked around, fully aware of his situation. There was no one nearby. The shops on this street had closed early. The yellow street lamps cast faint, diffused light onto the road, elongating the distorted shadows of Blake's group on the sidewalk. 5 of them, all waiting for a reaction, like wolves circling their prey. Matt, the most impulsive of the group, was the first to act. He stepped forward, grabbed Jamal by the collar, yanked him hard, forcing him to look into his eyes. The first mistake. The moment Matt's hand made contact, Jamal moved. No warning, no sign. In the blink of an eye, he tilted his body, twisted Matt's wrist behind him with a smooth lock, and at the same time snapped his wrist with a precise twist, causing him to scream in pain. Before anyone could react, Jamal used the momentum to pull sharply, lowering his center of gravity and slamming Matt to the pavement so fast he didn't even understand what happened. The sound of Matt's body hitting the sidewalk echoed sharply in the quiet air. Blake's eyes widened, frozen for a brief moment. Ryan paused, no longer wearing his usual mocking grin. Connor instinctively took a step back, his eyes now alert, because what had just happened was nothing like the typical school fight. Chase, the quietest in the group, was the only one to maintain his composure, but there was a clear shift in his gaze, a newfound caution. Matt rolled on the ground, groaning in pain, clutching his trembling wrist. He couldn't understand why, in just a split second, he had gone from being the aggressor to lying on the ground, completely controlled by the very person he thought was the prey. Blake squinted, his gaze darkening. This was not what he had expected. He had thought Jamal was just stubborn, that he stayed silent out of fear, that he refused to react because he didn't know what else to do. But the moment just now proved that Jamal wasn't afraid of them, had never been afraid, and perhaps it was Jamal who had chosen to hold back, not the weakling who couldn't fight back, and that made Blake feel uneasy. Jamal stood up, not in a hurry, not showing any tension after what had just happened. He took a slow breath, as if everything was still under control, then spoke for the first time since the provocation began. "I tried to avoid this." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces all fixated on him, then continued, his voice calm but with an underlying coldness. "But you're not worth me being afraid of." Blake felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't like this. He didn't like how Jamal spoke as if he and his group were nothing. He didn't like the calmness in his eyes. He didn't like the quiet confidence that didn't need to be flaunted. And most importantly, he didn't like the feeling that he was losing control. Ryan glanced at Blake, as if waiting for a signal. Matt was still on the ground, while Connor and Chase remained on high alert. The group could feel the atmosphere shifting. Jamal was no longer the prey they thought he was, but instead he could be a dangerous predator they had never faced before. Blake clenched his fists, but instead of ordering an attack, he did something even he hadn't expected. He stepped back. Though it was just a small movement, Ryan and Connor noticed, and they understood what it meant. Jamal noticed as well, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there, calmly observing, as if waiting to see what Blake would do next. No one spoke for a few seconds that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, Blake broke the silence, his voice now eerily calm. "This isn't over." He shot Jamal a cold, knife-like look, then turned and gestured for Ryan and Connor to help Matt up. Chase, as always, silently followed. Jamal watched them walk away, but in his heart he knew. Blake wasn't the type to simply give up like this. Tonight's encounter was just the beginning, and though Jamal didn't want to, he knew he had just stepped into a battle he couldn't avoid. The next morning, no official announcement was needed for anyone to know that something had just changed at Brookside High. The news spread faster than any rumor ever could, an obvious truth that no one could ignore or distort. Jamal Carter had knocked Matt Douglas out with a single punch. It wasn't a long, drawn-out fight, nor a fair one-on-one brawl, but a single strike, so quick that the witnesses didn't even have time to understand what had happened. Matt didn't just fall down, he was completely taken down without a chance to fight back. And most importantly, Jamal wasn't scared. The students in the school buzzed with gossip, stories exaggerated in their own unique ways. Some said Jamal had been part of a gang, others speculated he had military training, and some even spun wild tales about him beating an entire group of adults with his bare hands. No matter which rumors were true or false, one undeniable fact remained. Jamal was not someone who could be easily bullied, but that very fact made him even more mysterious. Those who had once seen him as an outsider now watched him with caution. Those who once laughed when they saw him being harassed now quietly observed from afar. His silence, once a sign of weakness, now carried an almost invisible threat. However, not everyone accepted this as an interesting story to gossip about. Mr. Reynolds, the history teacher at Brookside High, had been around long enough to know that something deeper was going on. He had taught at this school for over 20 years, witnessed countless groups of students grow up, seen many bullies, and seen many students become victims. But Jamal Carter was different from anyone he had encountered before. It wasn't just the calmness he maintained when facing Blake and his crew, or the way he accepted isolation without showing any sign of distress, but the way he moved. When he heard about the incident the night before, he wasn't surprised. He had noticed Jamal from the first day the boy stepped into his class. Not because he was one of the rare black students in an almost all-white town, but because he carried himself in a way that was very different from the others. He wasn't just another new student trying to survive. He was observing. And more than anyone, Mr. Reynolds knew how to recognize someone trained to fight. So when he saw Jamal sitting alone in the library during lunch, he decided to approach. He pulled out a chair and sat across from him, his calm gaze filled with genuine concern. "I've seen the way you move." Jamal didn't look up immediately. He turned a page in his book, eyes still fixed on the words before him. But when Mr. Reynolds didn't leave, Jamal realized this man wasn't like the others. Finally, he set the book down and looked up at the older teacher, a hidden wariness in his gaze. "Where did you learn that?" Jamal paused for a moment. This wasn't the first time he had been asked this question. But instead of avoiding it or changing the subject, he decided to tell the truth, because he knew this man wouldn't be easily fooled. "My dad used to be a professional fighter." The words were simple, but they carried a heavy weight. Mr. Reynolds nodded slowly, as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. Now he understood. Jamal wasn't fearless because he didn't know fear. He was fearless because he had been trained to control it. It wasn't the recklessness of kids who liked to fight in school. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of, and more importantly, knew when not to do anything at all. "So, you've been trained," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice thoughtful, as though evaluating something. "I'm guessing it's not just a few basic self-defense moves." Jamal didn't confirm or deny. He simply held that same steady gaze, calm, unshaken. "Do you understand what this means?" Mr. Reynolds leaned forward, his tone no longer that of a teacher interrogating a student, but of someone who had seen enough mistakes to know that some paths led to consequences that couldn't be undone. "I know Blake and his group won't let this slide. I also know you have the ability to stand up to them. But the issue isn't what you can do. It's what you'll choose to do." Jamal's expression didn't change, but deep down, he understood what Mr. Reynolds was trying to say. Strength wasn't the issue. The issue was how to use it, and he knew that once he crossed that line there would be no going back. But would Blake stop? He wasn't sure. And if not, what would he do? Outside the library, just a few steps away, someone else was also listening to this conversation. Blake Harrison stood against the wall near the window, every word from Jamal and Mr. Reynolds sinking into the deepest corners of his mind. When he heard the 3 words, professional fighter, his breath hitched. He had thought Jamal was just a stubborn kid, a student with a bit of courage, but now he realized he had completely misjudged him. Jamal wasn't some weakling who suddenly fought back. He was a predator, trained to control his instincts. And that made Blake angrier than ever. He couldn't let this go on. He couldn't let the whole school think he had been defeated. He wouldn't accept this ending like this. And in that moment, a plan began to form in his mind. A plan not just for revenge, but to put Jamal in a position where he couldn't escape. Because if Jamal wanted to play the patience game, Blake would force him to choose between standing still and acting. And he knew exactly how to make that happen. Blake couldn't bear the humiliation. He had always been the victor. Not because he was stronger than everyone else, but because he knew how to control the game, how to break others' confidence before they had a chance to fight back. But this time, things hadn't gone the way he wanted. He had expected a frightened Jamal, a Jamal cornered, a Jamal desperately begging for forgiveness. Instead, he faced a Jamal standing tall, a Jamal calm as if this was no big deal, a Jamal making him feel like he was the one being threatened. And the worst part was, everyone had seen it. The whole school was talking about how Blake Harrison and his group had been defeated, not by a fair fight, but by the undeniable truth that Jamal was stronger, that he couldn't break him, that he had lost. He could feel the change in the way people looked at him. Those who once looked at him with respect now gave him doubtful glances, as if they were reassessing whether he was still the king of Brookside High. He couldn't let this continue. He had to take back control, and the moment he overheard the conversation between Jamal and Mr. Reynolds, an idea formed in his mind. A plan not just for revenge, but to make sure Jamal couldn't keep avoiding him. Blake started spreading rumors. At first, he told just a few people, but like all rumors, once you plant a small seed in the right spot, it spreads like wildfire through dry woods. Jamal is just a coward. If he's really that good, why doesn't he fight me? He only knows how to sneak attack when no one's watching. If he was really tough, why doesn't he face me like a man? Maybe he just got lucky? Or maybe he's only strong when facing someone like Matt. Blake didn't need to say much. He just needed to plant an idea in their heads, and they'd turn it into the truth. As the students heard these rumors, they began to question things themselves. Yeah, why didn't Jamal fight Blake? If he was really that good, if he truly wasn't afraid of anyone, why didn't he stand up and prove it? Those questions started to spread, from whispers in the hallways to murmurs in the cafeteria. Just the day before, Jamal had been the hero. Students had looked at him with admiration, but now he was the one they doubted. Blake had changed the story. Now, Jamal wasn't the one who had beaten Blake. He was the one avoiding a fair fight. No longer the strong one, but the coward hiding. When Jamal entered the cafeteria that noon, he felt the shift immediately. No more admiring looks like yesterday. No more wary glances. Instead, there were quick, doubtful stares, whispers that followed him as he walked by, heads turning away hastily when he glanced back. Connor, always one to make things more dramatic, just happened to walk past Jamal's table and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I guess some people are only tough when no one's looking." Ryan immediately chimed in, Or maybe they're only tough against Matt. Matt's not exactly the brightest. Laughter erupted around them. Jamal stayed silent, but he didn't need to say anything. He could feel what was happening. He wasn't new to manipulation like this. He knew exactly what Blake was trying to do. Blake was forcing him to show his hand. He wanted to turn their battle into something inevitable. He wanted to turn Jamal from a victor into a coward, someone who would have to stand up and defend his honor by stepping into a fight Blake had already set up. Jamal looked to the far end of the cafeteria. Blake was sitting there, arms crossed, watching him with a smug grin. He had been pulled into this game. Jamal knew that if he kept ignoring it, the rumors would only spread further. If he kept silent, people would think Blake was right. If he refused the fight, not only would he lose respect, but he'd also put himself in a weak position. Blake had set a trap, and Jamal knew that the only way to destroy that trap was to face it head-on. But the question was he ready to do it his way, or would he get sucked into Blake's? Jamal could beat Blake. That was never the issue. But winning a fight didn't mean winning a war, and he needed to think carefully before stepping into the game Blake had laid out. Blake couldn't let the rumor grow on its own. He needed to control it, shape it in the most beneficial way for himself. People like him never let things get out of hand, and this time was no different. He needed one final move to corner Jamal, forcing him to choose between fighting or accepting eternal humiliation. He had been planning this moment all day, and that afternoon he made it happen. When the bell rang to signal the end of class, instead of letting everyone scatter as usual, Blake stepped into the middle of the sports field, where students were still hanging around before heading home, and loudly declared to the crowd, "Listen up, everyone." His voice rang out confidently, drawing the attention of those around him. Within seconds, the entire schoolyard was focused on him, and as expected, Connor, Ryan, Matt, and Chase quickly spread the news, pulling more people in. Blake folded his arms across his chest, scanning the crowd with complete control. We all heard about what happened last night. We all heard about Jamal Carter, the guy who took down Matt with one punch. A few murmurs spread through the crowd. Matt stood at the edge, fists clenched but saying nothing, still feeling the humiliation from last time. Blake continued, his voice shifting to a challenging tone. "But if he's that good, why is he avoiding me?" The air fell still for a few seconds. Blake narrowed his eyes, looking around the crowd, and then deliberately raised his voice, making sure everyone could hear. "If Jamal is really as strong as everyone says, why doesn't he dare face me? Or is he only good at sneaking attacks in the dark?" Whispers began to spread, eyes searching for Jamal in the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement, others looked confused, but everyone understood that this wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was becoming a reality. Blake shifted his gaze forward, and then he saw Jamal, standing not far away, as calm as ever. No sign of surprise, no anger, just observing. All eyes turned to Jamal. Blake squinted, smirking, and then threw out his final, decisive blow. "If Jamal won't fight me, then we all know he's just a liar." Silence. Complete silence. No one spoke, no one laughed, no one even breathed heavily. Everyone waited for Jamal's response, and then, after a brief but tense moment, Jamal stepped forward. He walked slowly, unhurried, not swept up in the storm Blake had just created. When he stopped in front of him, their eyes locked. An unspoken confrontation, where the weaker one would be exposed. But instead of getting angry, instead of explaining himself, instead of justifying his silence over the past days, Jamal simply spoke. his voice low and clear. "I don't fight people weaker than me." An invisible wave spread through the crowd. His words were like a sharp knife cutting through the air, leaving a deadly tension behind. Blake felt his body stiffen, as if he'd been punched in the stomach before he was ready. Everything was silent for 2 long seconds, then a burst of whispers erupted. Ryan blinked, unable to believe what he had just heard. Connor turned to Matt, mouth agape, while Chase furrowed his brows, for the first time showing a hint of surprise. Blake had never been spoken to like that in front of the whole school. His whole life, he had been the image of dominance, someone no one dared challenge. But now, right in the middle of the open, right in front of everyone, he had just been called weak. And worse? Jamal didn't say it as a joke. He said it like it was an obvious truth, as if Blake wasn't even worth the effort. For the first time in his life, Blake lost control. No more smug smiles, no more quiet confidence, no more composure of someone who always holds his ground. He felt his fists clench, his heart pounding in his chest, anger flaring up like a fire he couldn't put out. He had been humiliated. In front of everyone. In front of the whole school. If he didn't do something right now, from this moment on, he would no longer be the one in control. Without thinking, without planning, without hesitation, he swung his fist at Jamal. But he never hit him. Before the punch could get close, Jamal tilted his head to the side, a gentle but perfectly precise movement. Blake's fist missed the air, and in that moment of imbalance, he felt his arm being grabbed. And then, he lost complete control. Jamal didn't hit him. He simply pulled lightly, using Blake's own momentum, sending him stumbling forward with no way to control himself. Jamal released his grip at the perfect moment, and Blake staggered, losing all balance. He fell right in front of the entire school. Laughter erupted, not from one person, not from 2 people, but from the whole crowd. Jamal didn't need to hit him, he just let Blake destroy himself. Blake lay on the ground, his pride shattered with every laugh that echoed across the schoolyard. And this time, he knew that this was something he couldn't control anymore. Blake couldn't let this slide. He had lived his whole life as a controller, a predator at the top of the food chain, someone no one dared challenge. But in just a few brief seconds on the schoolyard, his image had been completely destroyed. Jamal had not only embarrassed him, but had done it in the most ruthless way, making him fall, turning him into a joke in front of the entire school. And worse, the guy didn't even need to hit him. It was all just a small movement, perfect control, utter calmness, and Blake had been brought down in front of everyone. Blake had never felt this angry before. From that day on, everything changed. No one avoided his gaze anymore. No more hesitant nods from the other students. No more the quiet respect he once thought was forever. Now, people looked at him differently. No longer with fear, but with contempt. Blake knew he couldn't reclaim his honor with mind games anymore. This time, he would end it the oldest, most primal way. No tricks, no tactics, just pure violence. And he had a plan. That night, Jamal walked toward the school's bike rack, where he usually parked his old bicycle. The air was unnaturally still. The streetlights cast faint, dim light on the ground, stretching distorted shadows. In the atmosphere there was something strange, an invisible tension creeping into every breath. Jamal sensed it immediately. He slowed to a stop, not turning around, but his shoulders tensed for a brief moment. Footsteps. Quiet, careful, but not subtle enough to avoid the ears trained to sense danger like Jamal's. He didn't need to turn around to know who was there. You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone with no consequences? Blake's voice rang out from behind, low and full of fury. Jamal didn't answer right away. He just took a slow breath, as if weighing his options. He could try to reason with him. He could ignore it and walk away. But from the tone of Blake's voice, from how he was holding his anger back in every word, Jamal knew Blake had already decided that tonight wasn't going to end peacefully. So when he slowly turned around, his expression was no longer indifferent. Blake and Ryan stood there, both looking tense but also ready to do anything to regain control. "You really want to do this?" Jamal asked, his voice devoid of threat. Simply a question. Blake clenched his fists, his eyes burning with the fire of wounded pride. "You have no other choice." Then he lunged. Blake threw a powerful punch, aimed directly at Jamal's face with all his might. But before the blow could land, Jamal moved. No rush, no panic, just perfect precision. He turned his head to the side, letting the punch skim his cheek, and before Blake had a chance to retract his arm, Jamal countered. He kicked straight into Blake's stomach. The kick didn't need to be that hard. It just needed to be at the right time and in the right place. And instantly, Blake was pushed back, gasping for breath from the unexpected force. He was sent sprawling, stumbling into a nearby parked car, coughing violently from the loss of air. Ryan didn't wait for Blake to get back up. He charged in, thinking he could take advantage of Jamal being focused on Blake to attack from behind. But Jamal had anticipated that. In just a second, he spun around, his right hand catching Ryan's wrist just as he threw a punch. Ryan didn't have time to react. Jamal twisted his wrist at an angle to reduce the force of the blow, then yanked hard, using Ryan's momentum to slam him down onto the ground. A heavy thud echoed as Ryan's back hit the concrete, pain coursing through his body immediately. Blake, now having regained his breath, his eyes wide in disbelief, saw Ryan sprawled on the ground, groaning from the fall. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that once again, Jamal had controlled the entire situation. Jamal didn't stand there to taunt, didn't make a show of challenging him. He simply stood upright, looking down at Blake with complete calmness. As if everything that had just happened was an event he had already known the outcome of. As if Blake had never had a chance from the start. Blake's humiliation was deeper than ever before. This time, he hadn't just lost in front of the whole school. He had lost even when no one was watching, with no one for him to blame or make excuses to. He had been defeated completely, in the most literal sense. And that drove him crazier than anything else. Blake knew that he couldn't keep charging at Jamal and expect a different result. The last 2 times he had thought that his strength and authority would overpower his opponent, but both times, not only did he lose, but he was also humiliated in the worst possible way. Jamal wasn't the type of person he could intimidate with threats or reckless punches, and that made him angrier than anything else. The problem wasn't that Jamal was stronger than him. The problem was that Jamal didn't see him as a threat. That drove Blake crazy. This time, he knew he had to change tactics. If one-on-one couldn't take Jamal down, he wouldn't let the fight unfold that way. He needed to create a situation where, no matter how fast, strong, or smart Jamal was, he wouldn't be able to win. He spent the next day gathering a team, not cowards who only knew how to provoke from afar, but people who could actually cause damage. Jason King, the wrestling team captain, known for his massive build and opponent control skills. Derek Lane, a hothead, who had been suspended multiple times for brawling. Zach Torres, the quietest but also the most dangerous, because he never fought without a reason, and once he engaged, he wouldn't stop until his opponent couldn't stand anymore. Blake spun a story that Jamal had embarrassed all the athletes in school, and that if they didn't teach him a lesson, sooner or later he'd disrespect them the way he had disrespected him. It didn't take long for the group to agree. He sent Jamal a short, blunt message, with no pretenses or hidden agendas. "Meet me after school, 5 p.m. A real fight. You have no choice." He didn't have to wait long for a response. "All right." No fuss, no questions, no sign of hesitation. Blake gripped his phone tightly, his eyes gleaming with malice. This time, Jamal wouldn't win. When the clock struck exactly 5 p.m., the sky had already started to turn a faint orange, stretching the shadows across the ground. At the back of the school, the emptiest spot, no teachers, no witnesses, just an empty dirt yard with some withered grass and old concrete walls. The perfect place for a confrontation that no one could stop. Blake walked forward with his team, Jason and Derek on either side like two walls of muscle. Ryan and Zach following closely behind, forming a lineup that anyone could tell wasn't an even match, but a premeditated slaughter. He felt his confidence return, that sense of power that had once been a natural part of him, a feeling Jamal had stripped away from him over the past days. This time, no one could save him, no one could help him escape this trap. But then, as he and his crew stepped into the yard, he saw Jamal standing there, waiting. He wasn't sitting, wasn't leaning against a wall, didn't look like someone who was cornered. He stood tall, hands in his pockets, his gaze calm as if this was just another normal afternoon. No fear, no hesitation. Only a calmness that made Blake feel uncomfortable to his core. He tried not to let the confusion show on his face, but deep down, he knew Jamal had known this was going to happen. And he still showed up. No allies, no weapons, no reason to believe he could win, but he still showed up. And for a brief moment, Blake felt something he never thought he would feel before Jamal. Worry. But he quickly pushed it away, focusing on what was about to happen. He smirked, took a step forward, and looked Jamal straight in the eye. This time, there's no escape. Jamal just shrugged, as if Blake had said something utterly ridiculous. "Do you really think I need an escape?" The words hit Blake's mind like a knife because they weren't an empty challenge, not a statement to sound tough. It was the truth. Jamal had no reason to run. He had no reason to be scared. And that made Blake feel more uneasy than ever. But now wasn't the time to doubt. He had come here to finish everything, and he would do it no matter what. He looked at Jason, giving a slow nod. No words, no complicated plans. Jason understood right away. Without waiting another second, Jason lunged forward, delivering a powerful opening strike. Jamal didn't move right away. He just stood there, observing, as if evaluating the situation, as if knowing the real fight hadn't even begun. And when Jason's punch was almost upon him, Jamal moved. Quick as the wind, precise as a machine. And then everything changed instantly. Jason charged forward, a towering figure like a predator, his fist swinging with all his might, aiming straight at Jamal with the intent to end the fight with a single blow. He was not like Blake or Ryan, who thrived on taunting and threatening words. Jason was a fighter. He didn't talk much. He simply believed no one could stand against him in a one-on-one fight. But there was one thing he didn't know. Jamal never fought one-on-one. As Jason's punch came toward him, Jamal didn't back down. He stepped forward. The moment happened so fast that the onlookers couldn't even tell what had just occurred. As Jason thought his fist was about to hit Jamal's face, Jamal had already disappeared from his original position, crouched low, and smoothly twisted his body to the side. By the time Jason realized what had happened, it was too late. Jamal spun, sweeping his leg straight into Jason's knee. Jason collapsed instantly, feeling a sharp pain shoot up his leg. But Jamal didn't stop there. In the same motion, he grabbed Jason's arm, yanked it forward, and used his own weight to throw him to the ground. A loud thud rang out as Jason's heavy body slammed against the concrete. He lay motionless for a few seconds, eyes wide, unable to believe what had just happened. Jamal never slowed down. The moment Jason hit the ground, Connor lunged in, trying to take advantage of the brief moment Jamal was still dealing with another opponent. He swung a punch, but Jamal had already anticipated it. Jamal didn't wait for the punch to come close. He stepped forward, forcefully swiping Connor's wrist aside, then rammed his shoulder straight into Connor's chest. Connor was knocked back, stumbling off balance, and just before he could regain his footing, Jamal delivered a spinning kick to his side, making him bend over and collapse to the ground, groaning in pain. Ryan and Derek witnessed the entire scene, and at that moment, both of them understood that this was not a fight they could win. Derek, known for his hot temper and aggression, stood frozen, his eyes locked on Jamal. Ryan didn't need to think twice. He turned and fled. Seeing this, Derek also lost the courage to continue. The two remaining men ran out of the backyard, leaving Blake standing alone. Jamal slowly turned his head, his gaze now no longer cold or angry. It was simply calm, as if what had just happened was the most natural thing in the world. He stepped forward, one step at a time, the sound of his shoes echoing loudly on the quiet concrete. Blake swallowed hard. He had always been the one in control. He had always been the one on top, the one setting the rules, the one deciding who was allowed to exist in the small world of Brookside High. But now, as he looked at Jamal, he no longer felt in control of anything. Everything he had once believed in, power, the fear he instilled in others, his ability to manipulate people into submission, had been completely shattered in one afternoon. Jamal stood before him without saying a word. Blake felt his heart pounding in his chest, each breath heavy, as if the air around him was squeezing him tighter. He could try to attack, but after what he had just witnessed, he knew it would be pointless. Jamal had won. Not just because he was stronger, but because Jamal had never feared him from the beginning. In that moment, for the first time in his life, Blake truly felt small. Jamal tilted his head, looking at him as if waiting to see what he would do next. But Blake did nothing. He no longer had the strength to resist, no more pride to keep fighting. He had lost, and this time there was no hiding it. Blake stood there, his chest heaving with each heavy breath. He had no choice left. Jamal had taken down each one of them, not only with strength but with absolute calmness, a level of control Blake had never seen before. He clenched his fists, cold sweat running down his spine. Every cell in his body screamed that he had to do something, anything, to regain his power, but he knew he had been completely defeated. Jamal stood there, his eyes on Blake with no pity, no contempt, and no sign of enjoying the victory. He just looked at him, as if finally seeing the true person behind the facade. Not a ruler, not the strong one, but just an arrogant kid who had just realized that he no longer held the power he once believed he had. Jamal didn't need to fight. He didn't need to end this with a punch or a kick, because Blake had already fallen on his own. Jamal just looked at him for a moment, then turned and walked away, saying nothing. In that moment, everything froze. No sound, no words. Nothing but the heavy silence that Blake could feel in every fiber of his being. But then, from somewhere, a round of applause erupted. At first, it was one person, then two, then the whole crowd. Before Blake could comprehend what was happening, the entire courtyard stood up, clapping loudly, as if they had just witnessed something far more important than a mere fight. They weren't applauding because Jamal had won. They were applauding because the ruler had been overthrown. Blake didn't dare look back, but he could feel every gaze directed at him. No longer were there looks of fear, no more false respect, only contempt, smug satisfaction, and worst of all, indifference. He was no longer the one everyone feared. He was just a defeated man. Jamal kept walking, not needing to look back, because he knew this was over. Not because he had beaten Blake, but because he had taken away the one thing Blake cherished most: his power. Blake stood there, alone in the middle of a crowd that had erupted in celebration, and for the first time in his life he was no longer the center of this world. The next morning, when the school bell rang to signal the start of a new school day, everyone realized that Brookside High had changed. The mocking laughter of Blake and his group was no longer echoing through the halls. There were no longer scenes of students being shoved into lockers or walking with their heads down in fear. No one was being bullied anymore. Blake didn't show up. No one spoke of him directly, but everyone understood that what had happened after school the day before had put an end to his reign. There were no more fearful looks when his name was mentioned, no more reluctant nods from students who had once been intimidated by him. Blake had become a thing of the past, and Brookside High was moving forward without him. The ones who had stood behind him, Ryan, Matt, Connor, had also disappeared from their usual spots. No one saw them as threats anymore, and no one cared to stand by their side. They had lost the one thing that gave them value: Blake's dominance. And most importantly, there were no more racial slurs. The sarcastic remarks, the hushed whispers, the cold, judging stares. Everything had vanished, as if they had never existed. Not because Brookside High had become a perfect place, but because no one had the courage to say those things anymore. Because they knew that if anyone dared to try, Jamal Carter was still there, still calm as ever, and no one wanted to test his limits again. But Jamal didn't care about his newfound reputation. He didn't walk the halls with smugness, didn't enjoy the admiring glances or whispers of respect. He wasn't concerned with becoming someone everyone respected or feared. He had never fought to become someone at Brookside. He just wanted to live peacefully. He still chose to sit at the same table in the cafeteria, still didn't initiate conversations with anyone, still walked silently down the hallways. But his silence was no longer misunderstood as weakness. Now, that silence was a sign of strength, a warning that Brookside High had changed, and anyone wanting to return to the old ways would have to face the reality that the world Blake Harrison once controlled no longer existed. A week passed, and Brookside High continued to operate in a new rhythm, one without Blake Harrison and the oppression he once imposed on the place. People began to get used to a different reality, one in which no one had to bow their head in fear while walking through the halls, and no one had to hesitate before those who once thought they had the right to decide who deserved respect and who did not. But even though Brookside had changed, one person still had not truly faced the truth: Blake Harrison. Since that day, he had nearly disappeared. No more arrogant words, no more challenging glares, no more of his familiar presence in the usual corners of the school grounds. Blake was no longer the Blake he once was, and he knew that. For an entire week he struggled with himself, trying to understand what had really caused his defeat. It wasn't because Jamal was stronger; he had accepted that truth. It wasn't because he lost control. He also understood that the power he once held was nothing more than a fragile illusion. He lost because he was wrong from the start. For the first time in his life, he realized that the fear he had once instilled wasn't real strength. Real strength lies in controlling oneself, not in controlling others. And Jamal, despite having had hundreds of opportunities to bring him down, did not do so. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to trample Blake to feel stronger. Jamal didn't fight out of hatred. He only fought to protect himself. And that made Blake feel smaller than all the times he had been defeated. A week later, on a late afternoon, Blake found Jamal in the back of the school, the place where everything had ended, and also where he knew he had to face the truth. Jamal stood there, as usual, quietly and calmly, as if nothing in the world could affect him. Blake walked up, no longer arrogant, no longer pretending to be strong. He took a deep breath, then said the two words he never thought he would say to anyone. "I was wrong." The words came out easier than he expected, but carried a weight he had never felt before. Jamal looked at him, his expression unchanged, with no contempt, no sense of triumph. He simply nodded. No long speeches, no accusations, no moral lectures, just a nod, as if Jamal had known long ago that this day would come. Blake didn't know how to feel about it, but as he turned and walked away, he felt a little lighter, as though he had finally taken off a burden he had placed on himself for so many years. Jamal also turned and walked in the opposite direction. No one said anything more. No one needed to say anything more, but from that day forward, everything at Brookside truly changed. Not just because the bully had fallen, but because the entire school had learned a lesson no one could forget. Brookside High was no longer the same. Blake's reign had collapsed, and the fear he had once spread disappeared with it. But this story wasn't just about a battle between a bully and someone brave enough to stand up against him. It was about real strength, not lying in violence, but in how we control ourselves. Jamal didn't win with fists. He won with patience, control, and most importantly, with not letting hatred define who he was. So, what about you? Have you ever had to face a bully or witness someone being treated unfairly? If you were in that situation, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to see more meaningful stories like this. See you in the next video.